Hello, you've got Lisa talking again. I'm here to redo my video on the G7 summit. I'd had to do so many takes because I've been absolutely dying of this cold that I'd uploaded a take with a glaring error in it that I thought I'd deleted. So I'm going to just redo the whole thing. And this is it. So I wanted to, the reason that I'm going to redo it is because actually the G7 summit is incredibly important. It contains a group of 7 countries who are considered the largest advanced economies in the world. But actually, when you start comparing gross national product, this is not the case. But this is an incredibly important group of countries, particularly as somebody looking from a UK perspective. Within this group, you have the US, you have Canada, you have Japan, you have Germany, you have France, you have Italy, and you have the UK. So immediately within this, you can see dynamics between the UK and the US, you can see dynamics between the UK and the EU, and you can see dynamics between the UK and the countries of the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. Japan in particular and Canada in particular are very important economies. So this is a really, really important summit, but it used to be called the G8 group. And Russia were part of this, but they have been suspended over their annexation of the Crimea. So in addition to these axes, it also gives you a view to looking at this axis of this very important territory on the Eurasian steppe. So this summit is incredibly important. Now the summit itself was hosted in Cornwall. This is symbolic. This is about UK saying we are on the world stage. We are still one of the most advanced economies in the world. Brexit might have happened, but we're still here. This is very, very important. But it's also important that the tone was set for the G7 summit by Joe Biden publicly reprimanding the UK over their failure to consider Northern Ireland and the impact of it in the Brexit processes. Now, this becomes a running theme through this summit. Now, while this reprimand is incredibly warranted, our neglect of Northern Ireland, Ireland are still part of the EU and the UK is not. So this has created a new type of border between Northern Ireland and kind of Southern Ireland. But this has also created problems where we have not considered the geographical position of Northern Ireland, certainly in terms of what's come to kind of define the subject of the G7 in the UK press, which is the sausage spat, which is about transit of chilled meats and sausages, because we no longer adhere to EU food safety regulations. So these issues are kind of playing out while this summit is ongoing. But this issue of kind of the US rebuking the UK was incredibly important for Joe Biden in asserting power dynamics, which were then kind of reinforced when I think Boris Johnson interrupted Joe Biden. And the power dynamics between these two men were very, very clear. The UK has been subordinated and the US is still a major world power, albeit a world power trying to redefine themselves and regain legitimacy after the Trump period, where one of the lowest points was Trump threatening the Ukraine in a phone call where he explicitly abused his power as the US president for domestic political gain. This is incredibly important stuff. Him rebuking the UK was about him saying to the world balance of power has changed. The UK have kind of slipped down the rankings, that we still take our role seriously and we are rebuking them over this, and it's warranted. Now, what was equally important was our response to Joe Biden. We didn't actually respond to Joe Biden and say, and argue, because that's the way power relations work. We immediately issued a narcissistic projection where we accused the EU of offensive remarks making Northern Ireland different to the UK. This was a narcissistic projection because A, we were afraid to acknowledge that we had been subordinated by the US. B, were afraid to acknowledge that we had not considered Northern Ireland properly, either the Good Friday Agreement or in the process of agreeing the trade deal. And C, we did not want to acknowledge that we have now signed a trade deal with the EU, which we have not considered properly, and whether the limitations of it from our perspective are going to come out through crisis, the sausage spat being one of them. Now I'm going to come back to the sausage spat, but the narcissistic projection is incredibly important. Narcissism is a very predictable behavior pattern. When you see it in an individual, all accusations will be admissions. They will not be able to take responsibility for their behavior. They will immediately project that kind of onto somebody else. They will accuse other people of their own failings. Accusations are admissions very reliably. Denial and demonstration will always be concurrent. So the narcissist will deny that they're doing something, but be demonstrating it at the same time in a way designed to cause dissonance. This is a structural problem because we have political media cultures who are only able to broadcast, who have transitioned to a social media environment. They've exposed all the kind of weaknesses and dysfunction in their culture, and kind of they've been at the center of the creation of kind of manufactured social media movements, which have been at the core of Brexit and Corbynism and Trumpism, which have created tremendous weakness. One of the major issues that was discussed by the G7 was how to respond to Russia's interference in foreign electoral processes. The demonstration of the narcissistic reflex to accuse the EU of our own failings was precisely the narcissistic reflex that Russia have been able to exploit. The social media movements that we have manufactured, Labour manufactured a youth movement which resulted in Corbynism, which was about subordinating and abusing welfare claimants and social care users, preventing them participating in democracy, which highlighted problems in our trade unions within the Labour Party itself, has left us without a functioning opposition and has actually generated considerable instability, as well as leaving Labour unelectable. Russia were able to exploit this social media movement and Russia today were openly grooming the anti-cuts movement while putting out media narratives about UK austerity, which allowed them to do this. The links between Trump and Putin are incredibly important when you look at the phone call to the Ukraine at the core of the indictment scandal, where Trump explicitly abused his power for domestic political gain. This is actually the context that the G7 is responding to. Russia were suspended from the G8 because of annexation of the Crimea. Last year there was a war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Azerbaijan are a country on the border of the Caspian Sea, which is a very crucial source of oil and gas supplies, provable oil and gas supplies. There are many oil producing countries who are facing questions over whether they have the oil supplies that they say. I would question whether there's any oil left in Iraq at all, but this is provable oil and gas supplies. There are 5 countries bordering the Caspian Sea: Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Russia and Iran. Turkey border the Black Sea and are discussing gas supplies in the Black Sea. These are very central and important geopolitical territories. Armenia occupies a very important point. They sit kind of alongside Georgia and the territory between the Black Sea and the Caspian and the rest of the steppe. They have been incredibly important geographically since Neolithic times, are central to understanding what we in the West euphemistically call the Silk Roads. They're getting their own video in a couple of weeks. But Armenia were at war with Azerbaijan over 6 weeks, and then the peace treaty was brokered by Russia. It is now seen that Armenia have been subordinated by Russia. Their president had to sit and have tea with Putin and listen visibly attentively like he was his mentor. The My Step coalition in Armenia are expected to take 75% of seats in the next election. 75%, when you start seeing numbers like that in a democracy, is a problem. There have been a series of situations in this part of the world that have really threatened Russia's kind of attempt to generate dominance. Russia's use of manufactured youth movements in much the same way as Labour manufactured Corbynism and they exploited it is a key problem here. There have been a series of what have been called the colour revolutions, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in the Ukraine. where the populations of these countries, in a world where digital means that they can participate in kind of communication in a way that people have never been able to before. These have been countries asserting autonomy as democracies and have resulted in changes of leaders. This has been a real threat to Putin. It is now perceived that Armenia have been subordinated. This is the context for the discussion about Russia's interference in political situations elsewhere. Not just because there are questions over Trump and Putin, not just because of their explicit exploitation of Corbynism, and not just because of the Brexit referendum, which also energized fascist elements in the same way in a number of other countries where the same dynamics and the digital axes are at play. This is serious stuff. With regards to the way that we responded to the rebuke by Joe Biden, the top line of his rebuke was the Good Friday Agreement. But we used it as narcissistic projection in one of the other situations that was playing out. Now, we have signed our deal with the EU. It is signed. We danced our way through negotiations, behaved very badly, we've not paid attention to what was in it, and this is coming out through crisis. Food exports to the EU fell by 47% in the first quarter of this year. When you look at that number over 2 years, it's 55%. This is very serious. The sausage spat is about the fact that within that trade deal we had not considered the geography of Northern Ireland. We had not considered food safety regulations. We had not considered any of this. But the back line of that deal is that the EU have explicitly said they will not accept us backsliding on our commitments. Our projection over the sausage spat is the political media culture who are at the core of driving these responses, who decided the whole world was leavers and remainers, who didn't bother to even pay attention to what was being negotiated and are just whipping up jingoism and projection of blame for this. They are not aware of what was in this trade deal and are now whipping up jingoism, which is driving government responses. Macron had to come out and say, we have not done what the UK say that we are doing. This is very serious. But this sausage spat also kind of underlines other changes to the UK economy that we are blind to because our political media culture and the advisory cultures plugged into government. They are busy watching Twitter and the political press. 1.3 million migrant workers have left the UK. This is our agriculture, social care, finance and health sectors who are dependent on these workers, and they have left. We have seen 400, in a study recently published last week, there are something like 400 financial firms who are displacing their resources to other European cities, Dublin, Frankfurt, Amsterdam. We have ignored that over about 10 years it's become apparent that the time zone of the UK, which made us a natural centre of economic power and market functioning between the US and the EU, it made us a natural centre. Our time zone has gradually gone out of step with the economic centres of the world, who are in the Far East, who are, we have the wrong time zone. But financial firms have taken the fact that in the Brexit deal, in the EU deal that we have, no leeway has been given over access to financial markets. The UK was seen as stymieing financial reform. The EU have used these negotiations to deal with that. We haven't noticed. So financial firms kind of are leaving the UK. This is our financial centre. This is at least 400 firms at the core of our financial centre. We have an overvalued housing market, overvalued by at least 50%, with a debt bubble underpinning it. We should have a political system who are avoiding shocks to manage this risk. The Bank of England have been central to stabilising us. But this, combined with this kind of evacuation of our financial centre and these responses being driven by this political media culture demonstrated through the G7, are incredibly important. And it all comes out because the political press and their advisory culture is at the core of this. they're just looking to kind of project an image and kind of deflect blame. What we get is the sausage spat and the Daily Express demanding people boycott EU goods. This is very, very serious. Now, when I was preparing kind of the video to do kind of my summary of the G7, I could not use the Telegraph, the Guardian, the New Statesman, the Spectator, the Sun, the Mirror, the Daily Mail, or the Express. Period. You can't use them for anything. You can't be informed. So even though our think tanks and advisory centres are kind of seeking to please them, you can't actually do anything with them. Their circulations are at nothing. They're reliant on these abusive media bubbles online that Russia can use to interfere in processes. I had to go to the Financial Times. I had to go to kind of foreign news outlets like Al Jazeera. I had to actually take my time. I tried to use a British foreign policy group summary of the G7, but it was so tailored to what the British political press want that it basically informed me of nothing. This is a very serious structural problem. Now, it's not a problem that only exists in the UK. This is a problem in every country when political media cultures are transitioning to a digital environment. And it's a problem in oppressive regimes that we've seen with the colour revolutions and the Arab Spring. This is a global change that is happening that's more or less done. These media cultures are in a tantrum, kind of in the last dregs of accepting that their world has changed. Now, the responses to the G7 summit are incredibly important. The G7 was accused by China of being a US-led bullying clique. Now, you can clearly see through kind of the processes of the G7 that this is not the case. And their problem is not actually the G7. Their problem is the comprehensive, progressive, trans-Pacific partnership. This is a group of many economies, very strong economies. It is not a US-led clique. Trump, in his period, kind of removed himself from its precursor. This is very strong economies working together to offset the weight of China in the Pacific Basin. China kind of and the US and kind of political media cultures who are not adjusting want us to see the world as China versus the US. But in actual fact, China had to criticize the G7 because that criticism could not be leveled at the comprehensive, progressive, trans-Pacific partnership. This is very important. Now, externally to the G7, the UK are still actually functioning on the world stage. We have refused to support Israel's annexation of the West Bank, thus showing our independence from the US and our ability to behave constructively. We have a UK envoy warning of famine in Ethiopia. This is again evidence of us being able to behave constructively on the world stage. But this is being undermined. While the G7 was playing out, while the media were driving up sausage spat, while these tensions are being discussed visibly with the G7, we had more domestic dysfunction on display with Dominic Cummings and his statements about text messages where Boris Johnson had slagged off the health minister. Now, I do not doubt that Boris Johnson has said this. I absolutely do not doubt it. But this is actually a very dangerous display of dysfunction at the heart of power that's actually being given to the whole world, including hostile powers. Now, one of the problems here is the predictability of this. This isolated little media culture are driving these responses. My thesis 5 years ago was able to identify a policy reflex where social policy and welfare systems were stripped back in response to crisis caused by other spending, with accusations as admissions being levelled at vulnerable people and those workers. This was at the core of the Corbynism manufactured youth-led movement. But I was able to predict that reflex 5 years ago as a British citizen. I am not a hostile power. Hostile powers are able to use that in the way that Putin is currently doing so. Now, the bottom line, the end note to the G7 summit was that the food surplus had been donated to a local food bank, like it was a good news story. But in actual fact, in the UK, we have social welfare systems which are structurally linked to our social care systems, to our child protection systems. If food banks are necessary, this is a sign of dysfunction in those other systems. A review was issued last week about the failure of UK child protection systems to offer support families are legally entitled to and require. This is the most vulnerable children in the country, children who've been harmed or could be harmed. And instead we had been behaving punitively in a way which will only generate more political crisis. This is very serious stuff, but the political press are not able to comment on this. They do not have this knowledge, and instead they sell it as a good news story about food banks and donated foods, going back to Neolithic times when the temples would redistribute food resources. And they have no clue that the world is not this kind of ancient, I don't know what it is that they think they're reverted us to. And while this culture go round around on Twitter and within these newspapers that nobody reads, this is still driving government reflexes. Now, these are still countries. The G7 is a group of countries who are actually working together. Powerful economies all over the world are working together to maintain stability. But it's these media cultures, you know, if you watch the outcomes for G7, you think that the only outcome was about America and China. America and China are not the only countries in the world. We are in a highly developed global economic context, and we are in a state of flux, which the G7 gives us tremendous insight into the shaping of. Now, I'm going to come back on Sunday. Like, I've reached the point with those history videos where I've kind of laid the basis of like world, kind of the nervous system of the world economy. And what I'm now going to start doing is looking at the development of civilizations that allows me to break down this geography of the Eurasian steppe, the territories between Europe and China. I'm going to start by looking at Greek and Persian civilization, who are incredibly important, and I'm kind of going to look at their economic functioning and their relationship with each other, which is not quite what we in the modern world think. And then after that, I'm going to start to break down the geography of the steppe, particularly looking at countries like Armenia, who have always played a very important role as a stabilizer in this geography. And then I'm going to kind of look at Eastern Asia, which is kind of the kind of Central Asia. I think the word that we're using now is Central Asia, not Eastern Asia. Sorry, ignore me, I'm ill. Like Central Asia. So this is the countries around Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, the countries bordering the Caspian Sea, which have also been incredibly important throughout history in terms of the dynamics and relationships between what we in the modern world call West and East. So I'll be back on Sunday for that. Next week, I'm coming back with a video looking at a book called Capital in the 21st Century, written by a guy called Thomas Piketty, and the origins of the think tank and advisory culture around these newspapers who are currently driving crisis, because it's quite interesting to look at. And also Thomas Piketty, he taught me at the LSE, so that would be quite interesting to revisit. So I'll be back on Sunday with a history video. I'll be back next Wednesday looking at that, and thank you for sticking with me today. This was my review of the G7 summit, finally, and I'm going to go and have a cup of tea now.